Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Today, we have with us Kathryn Huether, who is a postdoctoral research associate in Antisemitism Studies at UCLA's Initiative to Study Hate and the Leve Center for Jewish Studies. She received her PhD in musicology with a graduate minor in cultural studies from the University of Minnesota in 2021 and holds a second master's in religious studies from the University of Colorado. She has held visiting appointments at Bowdoin College and Vanderbilt University and was the 2021 to 2022 United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Research and American University Postdoctoral Fellow. Her research explores how sound mediates Holocaust memory, anti-Semitism, and racial violence, and how voice, in its broadest sense, including textual and typed forms, intersects with AI in algorithmic surveillance, hate speech moderation, and online spaces. Her book project, Sounding Trauma, Mediating Memory, examines the impact of sound technologies on mediating Holocaust memory. Her second book, Sounding the Holocaust in Film, which is a forthcoming book, serves as a teaching guide to sound in Holocaust cinema. She has published in Sound Studies, an interdisciplinary journal, and has forthcoming articles in Music and Politics and the Journal for the Society of American Music. Additionally, she has served as a guest editor for Sounding Out, the Sound Studies blog, and was invited to contribute the same chapter on social media for forthcoming Oxford Handbook on Sound, Music, and Antisemitism. She has also been an invited educator at two regional institutes of the Holocaust Education Foundation of Northwestern and a guest speaker on Tablets magazine, which was titled Unorthodox Podcast Episode for their 2024 International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Welcome, Kathryn. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berza and just University of Texas for having me. I was really honored to receive the invitation to speak today. Just let me share my PowerPoint really quick and we will get started. My engagement with this project, listening to the archive, and also is attached to the Sound Studies article that Dr. Berza mentioned, began in 2019 during my graduate fellowship at USHMM. That summer, I found myself drawn each week to the museum's first-person program, and this is a photograph of their very first program scanned from the institutional archives. First Person is a public interview series with Holocaust survivors, hosted most often by Bill Benson. Since its launch in 2000, First Person has offered audiences direct encounters with survivor testimony. And as Benson explained to me, it was, quote, an extraordinary opportunity for survivors to share what they went through to an audience that has likely never heard anything like it, end quote. Although First Person was not the official focus of my fellowship then, it soon became the center of my attention. When I returned as the 2021-22 USHMM and American University Postdoctoral Fellow, it had become the very reason for my presence at the museum. That was when my work shifted from attending live interviews to studying the archive, listening intently to the recordings and shaping the analysis that I will present here today. And just as a timely note, the museum actually just announced that First Person will end this December, closing a remarkable chapter in its history. What drew me to First Person and what I find makes it distinctive from other testimony programs is not only its longitudinal structure, but its habitual recurrence and recordings of such. There are certainly other examples of longitudinal Holocaust testimony projects where survivors are interviewed at multiple points in their lives. But First Person, I strongly believe, is different. And I want to be specific here in that First Person started in 2000, and it has gone every single year since then. And some survivors have spoken back to back, and they say basically the same thing in the same format. And this is what I'm really focused on. And the fact that we have all those recordings, I think, is really, really significant. And certainly other museums have hosted survivors in this format, but we don't have access to those collections. And one example that I know of this is I do work at the Museum of Tolerance here, and while they do have recordings, they are not accessible in archives like we have at USHMM. So this annual rhythm created pattern retelling shaped by age, audience, and an institutional setting, producing a sonic archive that is as much about performance of testimony as it is about the words themselves. Benson often noted that this recurrence gave him opportunities to revisit moments survivors had initially glossed over, helping them articulate emotional truths that might otherwise remain unspoken. So other words, I think the uniqueness of first person is actually the fact that it does adhere to a sort of script. I want to kind of draw attention as well, as Elada Osman reminds us, that an archive is not a museum. It is not designed for public access and popular presentations. The archive, in other words, is not a form of presentation, but of preservation. It collects and stores information. It does not arrange, exhibit, process, or interpret it. In the case of first person, however, this claim is actually paradoxical, since the program is built entirely around public engagement first, with its archive emerging almost as a secondary outcome. So this inversion of public program first and archive second marks first person as a resource for thinking about how testimony is both live performance and recorded memory. The very first survivor I heard in first person was Augie Giva, and from the start, I was struck by her deliberate engagement with language, how certain words carried particular weight, how cadence and phrasing layered meaning beyond the narrative itself. Later, when I returned to the archive and listened to earlier recordings of her talk, I began to notice their habitual rhythm, the sonic patterns that unfolded across years of retelling. Augie was really the spark for this project, but also the spark for how I think about sound and Holocaust memory more broadly. And getting to know her continued to fuel it. And it was only after we lost her last year that I felt I could truly finally finish this work. Well, she is not a case study that I engage with today. She is a case study that I engage with in the larger project, but I just wanted to acknowledge her significance to this work. Over 25 seasons of first person, it has featured more than 100 survivors. And if this graph looks a little bit daunting, it's supposed to. Certainly every archive that we have of survivor testimony is very large. We have USC Shoah Foundation, we have the Fortunoff, we have USHMM's collections, which features, of course, far more actually than 100 survivor voices. But the fact that we have 115 total that speak year to year back to back, and we have this longitudinal archive, those don't exist actually in USC, in USHMM, in the Fortunoff, and that is what is significant about first person. And just to note that this is only through 2022 when my postdoc finished. I haven't updated the graph since then. There have been extended periods from beyond that. With this public program turned archive, I turned my attention to the voice itself, both narratively and affectively. And to make sense of these dynamics, I relied on a dual approach of close and distant listening, building on Todd Presner's recently published book, Ethics of the Algorithm, and his use of close and distant listening. This lens allows us to hear testimony not only for its words, but for the ways it is embodied, repeated, and transformed over time. I very much want to thank Todd for articulating this conceptual frame, and it felt like the missing piece in clarifying my approach, and has had shaped my thinking since his book appeared last year. I've been very grateful for his conversation and guidance since I've been at UCLA. This framework makes audible both the consistencies that stabilize memory and the subtle shifts that reveal its ongoing negotiation. Presner defines distant listening as subtle shifts that reveal distant listening as humanistic use of computational tools to identify patterns and differences in the sonic record, not to generalize or abstract, but to surface those moments where voice cuts through as undeniable affect. Adding to this, distant listening reveals the long arc. It is what allows us to step back, compare recordings across years, and hear consistencies and shifts that only become clear when testimony is studied longitudinally. Close listening in Presner's formulation asks us to slow down and attend to the most granular vocal details, the pitch of a word, the breath of a sigh, a pause before a difficult memory, or the tremor that accompanies aging. In short, close listening hears those intimate details. What allows us to notice how even the smallest inflections change the character of testimony and how those microtextures give voice to the memory in ways that transcripts cannot capture. Building on Presner's model, I approached the longitudinal dimension of first person specifically, asking what emerges when we analyze Holocaust testimony, not as an isolated telling, but as an ongoing vocal practice that accrues meaning through age, relational dynamics, institutional setting, and the sonic grain of the voice itself. And I recognize that these approaches are not new entirely in Holocaust studies, but I do very much think for the affective quality of voice, that is what I'm adding to this approach. This is not certainly the first longitudinal approach in Holocaust research, and any Holocaust scholars here know this, very much so. And most significantly, Henry Greenspan's decades of dialogic work with survivors remain foundational, emphasizing the evolving nature of testimony across repeated conversations and highlighting how setting, interlocutor, and context shape what is said. My approach builds on this legacy while diverging in key ways. Greenspan's model is built on long-term relationships in which testimony unfolds across many different conversations with the same interlocutor. And while yes, first person also has a form of long-term relationships, what matters most in Greenspan's approach is that variability aspect, the shifting context, moods, and narrative emphases that emerge when survivors speak in different times and spaces. In the case of first person, it is the same institutional space. For the most part, it's always Benson. Also, that scripted aspect, they follow that exact same pattern year to year to year. While language and accent certainly shape vocal affect, I do want to just note my emphasis today is pretty much on acoustic and expressive features. And in future studies of this work, I would certainly encourage people to consider those language and accent aspects. But at the same time, I do recognize that language itself and the resonance it carries can become central. And I'll suggest a point of this in the Fritz Gluckstein example that we'll look at in a little bit. For my analyses, I rely on the platform Sonic Visualizer, which is an open source tool that allows layered spectrographic comparison. Unlike other programs such as PRAT, which is a vocal analysis program, which is used widely in phonetics and linguistics, I found Sonic Visualizer to be more intuitive for handling longer recordings and for layering the multiple tracks visually, which you'll see in some of the diagrams that I'll share today. This is a freely available program, and Pratt is too, but it means that you can experiment with the kind of analyses that I'm describing here without any sort of specialized training in phonetics. As an example, any of these you could use for the sort of approach that I'm describing today. And as an example, if you go to the distant and close listening chapter in Todd Presner's book, Ethics of the Algorithm, he does use Pratt and has a slightly different approach from what I take. Again, the focal points that I wanted to highlight, I thought that Sonic Visualizer was much easier, but again, I think it's about the intent and the specific qualities of the voice that you want to bring to the fore, and what program would be the best for you. With Sonic Visualizer, I use it to visualize habituation and variation, shifts in amplitude, pitch contour, tonal compression, and tempo, while pairing these visual traces with close listening to breath pauses and emotional cadence. With this framework in place, I will turn now to what this kind of listening actually looks like in practice. And to do so, I'm going to look at two individuals from the first person program. And again, these are just two from over 100 different ones. But these two individuals were from the very start of first person participating in it, very much involved, spoke over 15 times. And their voices, I found, offer complementary insights into how testimony changes or holds steady across years of repetition. In the case of Nessie Godin, this highlights transformation, while in the case of Gluckstein, by contrast, we see the power of consistency, yet also we have these kind of subtle traces of aging that are very much present within his voice. And I think together, these two case studies very much highlight how these close and distant listening can surface dimensions of memory that risk being overlooked when we just focus on the words or transcripts. Nessie Godin was unique among the first-person participants in that her testimonies did not actually begin as conversations, but as straight monologue. She was literally the only individual at the very start of the program to speak on her own. She refused to speak with Benson. She got up there, solely gave a monologue. From 2002 to 2009, she adhered in this format, with one small exception in 2004, excuse me, where USHMM historian Dr. William Meineke appeared as a sort of interlocutor, but that exchange does lack the sort of dialogic depth and still really closely mirrors her solo narratives. This changed in 2011 when she did actually begin to take part in the conversational format with USHMM historian Dr. Patricia Haberer-Rice. And again, she was the only one, that Dr. Patricia Haberer-Rice, that she did the one-on-one format with. Haberer-Rice did not do this with other participants. And with this transition, Godin's testimony actually shifts as well, not only in tone, rhythm, and sound, but also gradually in content too. And listening to Godin's first-person appearances over time reveals a reframing of her emotional engagement with memory in ways shaped not only by her natural aging, but also by the repetitive nature of the program, and most importantly, by her growing ease within the first-person setting and her community. I'm going to focus on two moments in particular that I think really highlight this consistency and change in Godin's delivery. First, her ritualized opening, and second, there's one in particular moment where she recalls her father's death. From 2002 to 2009, Godin began her first-person talks with virtually the same statement. She introduced her name and then said, "I'm not a speaker, I'm not a lecturer, I'm not a teacher. What I am is a Holocaust survivor." A refrain that remained almost identical across the years with only minor variations. Here's the monologue from 2002.
Good afternoon. You all heard my name is Nessie Godin. I don't know, maybe some of you thought that you are coming to listen to a speaker. I'm not a speaker, I'm not a lecturer, I'm not a teacher. What I am is a survivor of the Holocaust.
With a distant listening analysis, we can see visually the vocal consistency across the monologue years. And here you can see 4 of them from 2002 to 2005, 2007, and 2009. You can see the words as well over it. Sometimes she flips the "I'm not a speaker, I'm not a lecturer, I'm not a teacher." She'll change the teacher or lecturer. For the most part, it's pretty consistent. Just to play it one more time so you can hear 2002 in your ears.
Good afternoon. You all heard my name is Nessie Godin. I don't know, maybe some of you thought that you are coming to listen to a speaker. I'm not a speaker, I'm not a lecturer, I'm not a teacher. What I am is a survivor of the Holocaust.
And here's 2009.
Thank you, Anne, very much. Welcome, everybody. You heard my name is Nessie Godin. And I'm not a speaker or a teacher or a lecturer. What I am is a survivor of the Holocaust.
So in 2009, her voice it is a little bit more calm, a little bit more free-flowing, but it's still the exact same pattern of "I'm not a speaker, I'm not a teacher, I'm not a lecturer. What I am is a survivor of the Holocaust." And distant listening brings into focus the fact that even over nearly a decade, this pacing, articulation, and emphasis stay almost identical. This tells us that Godin's opening functioned almost like a ritual, consistent, nearly rehearsed, but with small micro adjustments that reflected context, comfort, or the presence of particular people in the room. And I'll show this in just a moment. And I know that this is not a revelation for Holocaust studies. We all know that some testimonies can and are be performative. However, the point of this is that listening this way distantly makes clear how stability and variation can coexist in testimony, and how that same line can anchor identity year after year, while still registering that subtle traces of aging, relationality, and labor of speaking. And I think the fact that we can visualize it is really significant. Because it's one thing to look at it and just brush it off as a performance, and another to really reflect on this larger context as to why it is occurring. With distant listening, spectrographic analysis highlights consistency in Godin's testimony, but adding then this layer of transcription offers another layer to understanding it. Read side by side, the transcripts of her monologue years confirm the stability of her refrain while also surfacing small but telling variations. Sometimes she adds dedications, sometimes she acknowledges friends or staff in the audiences, and sometimes she pauses on her own name. These deviations, while subtle, point to her growing ease within the institutional setting and her deepening ties with staff and fellow survivors. But they also point to the particular moment in time when she is giving her first person, something reflected in what Annette Viviorca asserts of testimony when she describes testimony as, quote, testimonies, particularly when they are produced as part of a larger cultural movement, express the discourses or discourses valued by society at the moment the witnesses tell their stories as much as they render an individual experience. In principle, testimonies demonstrate that every individual, every life, every experience of the Holocaust is irreducibly unique. But they demonstrate this uniqueness using the language of the time in which they are delivered and in response to questions motivated by political and ideological concerns. Quote. As an example of this, one year stands out in particular. 2006, it is the only opening monologue in which Godin stutters, a moment break in which her otherwise confident cadence as she attempts to deliver the line, maybe you expected a speaker, a teacher. The stutter alone marks a vocal and emotional deviation, but the year's context deepens its impact. That day was actually her mother's birthday, which she explicitly names and dedicates the talk to. In that moment, the testimonial space becomes both commemorative and relational, collapsing past and present, grief and performance. Now, I recognize this might not be a political or ideological concern, but it is positioning it within a particular time and place and reflecting that within her testimony. And there'll be a second example of this in the next study of Godin's that does very much contextualize it in a political moment. Beginning in 2011, Godin shifted fully to the one-on-one interview format, and her once consistent opening disappears. From 2011 to 2017, her conversational introductions vary widely, sometimes beginning with her family, sometimes with photographs, sometimes with a historical overview of Jewish life in Lithuania. Unlike her monologue years, this later period resists distant listening. There is no repeated anchor line to map spectrally across time. Here, close listening becomes more generative, drawing attention to her relational exchanges with interviewer Patricia Heber-Rice and to how her self-presentation adapts institutional, pedagogical, and interpersonal cues. And just so you can hear how much it changed from her very first monologue, here is her last first-person opening in 2017.
We're a team, right?
That's right.
So, do you want to start first by telling me what life was like before World War II broke out in Lithuania? Can you tell us a little bit about what your family did? How old you were?
Well, I tell you, Lithuania, Jewish people were invited to be there by one of the kings, because Lithuanian people mostly were farmers. So Vytautas Didysis, that was his name, he started to invite Jewish people, and Jewish people came, and some were already from other areas. And
I think a point that is most significant from this first person, and that happens at no other point in her first person, is that opening that Patricia says, we're a team, right? And I think that really signifies that kind of comfortability that Godin now has in her environment and with the staff. This is the only first person that ever occurs in, and I think that this is really significant overall. Taken together, Godin's openings reveal both stability and transformation. In the early years, spectrograms and transcripts, forms of distant listening, can show this ritualized entry point that is nearly identical across time. But in the later years, close listening becomes essential to capture this variability of her conversational framing. And through both methods, we can see that her testimony was never static repetition, but an evolving negotiation between memory, voice, and audience. The second moment that I want to highlight in Godin's testimony is her account of her father's death. In every one of her first persons, Godin recounts the murder of her father, and it almost always surfaces around the midpoint of her narrative. And during her monologue format years, this memory surfaces with a striking cadence. Each time she repeats, I don't ask a question about millions. Millions is a very big number. I ask a question about one human being, my dad. And I'll play it so you can hear her voice in 2002.
My dear friends, on that selection, I lost my father. He was 47 years old. I don't ask a question about millions. Millions is a very big number. I ask a question about one human being. My dad. He was a kind man. He didn't rob, he didn't kill, he didn't insult anybody. Why was he killed? He was killed because of that evil that was allowed in humanity.
In this refrain, Godin directly names the incomprehensible scale of millions, but she refuses to let memory remain at that level of abstraction. Instead, she brings it back to the singular embodied loss of her father, and it is not just the words, but the way she voices them that gives this moment its force. The breath before she speaks, the pauses between phrases, that downward inflection of "my dad." These vocal details make audible both the persistence of grief and in the possibility of closure for her in the early years. She continues this in her monologues specifically, but this actually changes when she shifts to the one-on-one. But one aspect that never changes is when she does the opening, "My dear friends, on that selection, I lost my father." And that phrase actually remains consistent throughout all of her first persons, except for the very last one. And that very last one, Patricia actually has to bring her back to tell her the story. And this is when her memory is very much fading, which is also the reason why, unfortunately, 2017 was her last first person. And so you can see here in this spectrogram from 2002, 2006, 2007, 2013, 2015, on that selection, "I lost my father," that phrase is identical almost every single time. "I lost my father," you have that drop, that moment is very, very significant. And so you can hear it in 2013.
My dear friends, on that selection, I lost my father. That was his day off. He was killed because he was too strong. He may fight them back. After the children.
So in 2013, the grief is still present, but is actually joined by a quieter, more explanatory tone. In this moment, she actually begins to shift her father's murder in terms of logic, that he was strong, healthy, perhaps seen as someone who might fight back. Her voice steadies, her cadence becomes less searching, more declarative. The injustice remains, but is no longer unknowable. Close listening lets us hear the shift in the texture of delivery, the movement from breath-heavy pauses and questioning inflection. And you can see here in the transcription, so this shift in 2009, one moment. So the shift in 2013, "My dear friends, on that selection, I lost my father." This is when she's shifting to that logical aspect. And then we have this moment in 2009 where this narrative actually is changed completely from any other moment. And this is when it's grounding it in a political moment. In that year, this is when U.S. government initiated steps to deport 89-year-old John Demjanjuk to Germany, where he faced charges of assisting in the murder of at least 29,000 Jews at the Sobibor death camp. And this is when Godin says, "My father didn't live to be 89." And this is where this is contextualized within her testimony, and we have this variation. The last case study I want to look at is with Fritz Gluckstein's first person. And while Godin exemplifies how a survivor might revise or refrain their emotional engagement with certain memories over time, Gluckstein actually offers a counterpoint through the remarkable consistency of his narrative, but the aging quality of his voice is much more dramatic. Across his conversations, his retellings remain nearly identical in content, yet vary in tonal delivery. I found one moment particularly reflective of natural effects of vocal aging, a moment that also happens to be in part a recitation and embodiment of his own father's words. Gluckstein appeared on the program 18 times, capturing his voice over nearly 2 decades, from the ages of 74 to 91. Gluckstein's moment recounts the day in 1933 when his father was forced to resign from his civil service position. And I'm going to play the entire exchange in 2002 between Benson and Gluckstein so you can hear the context. But what I want you to listen for is this moment when he says, no, he said, "No, I came in by the front door and I'm going to leave by the front door."
Your father was actually a decorated veteran of the
Yes,
First World
my
War.
father was in the war, got the Iron Cross, But he still lost his job when Hitler came to power, and it was in January 1933. When he was at the office, he was told that he was no longer needed and was asked to leave the court building. And he said, well, outside there's a group of Nazis demonstrating. Better leave by the back door. He said, no, I came in by the front door, and I'm going to leave by the front door. And he left by the front door, went right through the demonstrating his arm.
So throughout all of his first persons, he very much emphasizes this, no, I came in by the front door and I'm going to leave by the front door. And sometimes it changes where he emphasizes the said, but that no, in, and leave are always, always present. Sometimes the leave he replaces with out, but those three words always he's emphasizing across every single one of his retellings. Based on a close listening analysis and my own conversations with Gluckstein, I read this moment not simply as a recollection of an event, but as a vocal channeling actually of his own father, how his own father used to tell the story. In this sense, the line contains more than Gluckstein's own voice. It resonates as an echo of his father's. I also recognize that his father would have originally spoken in German, and so we cannot know the exact phrasing, but a sentence such as Nein, ich bin durch die Vordertür gekommen und werde auch durch die Vordertür gehen would also carry similar cadence and assertiveness. The emphasis on Nein, no, durch, through, and auch also suggests that the emotional rhythm of the line could transcend linguistic boundaries and that Gluckstein is indeed still remembering his father's voice in this moment. So we could read this as a layering of voices, his father's embodied through Fritz's own, as an active sort of tension between the continuity and loss in the way that Greenspan identifies as central to survivor testimony, the simultaneous preservation of memory's origin, and the inevitable erosion introduced through its retelling. And I highlight this because I think it kind of surpasses this aging quality that even despite the fact that Gluckstein's body is aging, perhaps his mind, that because this is drawing from his father's memory as well, that it's kind of, it surpasses all of that. And so what Greenspan states is that survivors' voices are thus themselves gatherings. In some precarious balance, each contains both the rhythms of its origin and the cacophony of its dissolution. This complexity within survivors' voices is most evident when they speak specifically as survivors, when they take the role of witness or recounter and attempt to retell what they remember. The phrase endures, stable in wording, yet increasingly textured by the aging vocal body that carries it. In Gluckstein's delivery, the line is not merely repeated, it is reanimated. 2012 marks the first year in which Gluckstein's aging voice becomes distinctly perceptible, not through slower pacing, but through a reallocation of vocal energy. So you can see here how it's almost the exact same phrasing. The 2012 is in the gray, and 2002 is in the red from the spectrogram, but so you can hear 2012.
No, said my father, I came in by the front door and I leave by the front door.
So as early.
So 2012 is sustained with greater evenness and vocal control. This produces a smoother, more continuous waveform, as you can see. It's not as spiked visually in this distant listening, suggesting not a weakening of memory, but just an adjustment in the voice. This more measured vocal profile remains consistent through 2015 with minimal variation. And Gluckstein's 2015 retelling very much resembles 2012. It's almost identical, but so you can hear 2015.
Well, my father said, I came in the front door and I will leave by the front door. And so he did.
In and leave are a little bit more prominent in this mark. 2019, his very last first person, is actually the moment where the retelling drops the most. His retelling extends from the consistent 4-second duration observed in previous years to 6 seconds. While the familiar emphatic words no, in, and leave are still present, their articulation changes. In this version, each of these words is initially accented, but followed by an extended vocal downtick, which contributes to the slower overall phrasing. And this lengthening reflects not a loss of inflection shaped by age. The rest of the phrase retains the sustained vocal style heard in earlier years, and is a continuity in delivery, even as subtle shifts in prosody signal the body's temporal arc. We can also see it in his aging body, but this is his final first person.
I came in by the front door, and I will leave by the front door, and he walked out the front door.
In closing, what listening to first person shows us is that testimony is not fixed, a one-time statement. It is living, embodied practice that unfolds across years and that can be heard in affective dimensions of the voice. Through voices like Nessie Godin's and Fritz Gluckstein's, we can hear how memory is carried not only in words, but in tone, cadence, breath, rhythm, and aging. Sometimes the voice steadies into ritualized refrains, sometimes it falters or shifts, signaling aging, grief, or the labor of repetition. And I recognize that I think we know this, but imagine if you were to hear Fritz's very first person, and then his last one. I think the way that it is received by the audience, those receptions are quite different. And I don't think we've really thought about that in the way that testimony has been presented. But by applying close and distant listening, we begin to see testimony not as a static repetition, but as evolving negotiation. Why does this matter? And I think because nearly all survivor testimonies obviously now exist in recordings. If we only read the transcripts, we miss how the voice ages, how grief or resolve inflects delivery, and how repetition itself becomes a sonic marker of memory. Listening in this way reminds us that testimony is never frozen. It trembles, it steadies, softens, hardens. It accrues meaning through time, through relationships, through the survivor's body. But I also think listening this way may offer us new insights to pre-existing testimony that we have not heard before. The first person archive with its hundreds of hours of recordings remains largely untapped. And while it is not the only instance where public programs have become archival records, similar formats exist in museums, synagogues, and community centers around the world. It is an especially rich case study because of its unusual consistency and its accessibility, and precisely this kind of resource has the potential to push Holocaust studies and memory studies more broadly to take voice seriously, the sonic aspects of the voice as an ethical and affective medium of memory. My hope is that this project models one way of doing so while also pointing toward the need for further work that seeks out and engages other public-turned archival forms, but also into the realm of sound studies. Thank you.